No idea in the history of the world has been more misused. No philosopher has been more quoted by people who have not read him. No name has been used to justify more suffering and more liberation than his. Karl Marx, the man who wanted to free humanity, whose ideas were used to imprison it. To understand Marx, you must first understand the world he was born into. 1818, Trier, Prussia, a small city on the banks of the Moselle River. Europe is in the middle of the most violent economic transformation in human history, the Industrial Revolution. Within a single generation, within living memory, millions of people who had lived as farmers, as craftsmen, as members of small self-sufficient communities have been uprooted, driven into cities, packed into factories, working 14, 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages that barely kept them alive. Children as young as 5 worked in coal mines. Women gave birth in factories and were back at their machines within hours. The cities were overwhelming, filthy, overcrowded, diseased. Life expectancy in industrial Manchester was lower than in ancient Rome. And at the same time, in the same cities, a tiny minority was accumulating more wealth than any group of people had ever accumulated in the history of civilization. The factory owners, the industrialists, the men who owned the machines. Marx looked at this world and asked a question that no economist, no philosopher, no politician was asking loudly enough. How is this possible? How can the people who produce everything, who mine the coal, who weave the cloth, who build the railways, who manufacture the goods, have so little, while the people who own the means of production, who own the factories and the machines, have everything? Marx spent his life trying to answer that question. He was a philosopher, a historian, an economist, a journalist, and a revolutionary, sometimes all at once. He was also, by most accounts, a terrible manager of his own life. He lived in poverty for most of his adult years. 3 of his children died in infancy, partly due to the conditions in which the family lived. He was supported financially by his lifelong friend and collaborator, Friedrich Engels, the son of a factory owner who had seen the conditions of the working class firsthand and was appalled. Marx and Engels were the most consequential intellectual partnership of the 19th century. Together they wrote a document that would change history. The Communist Manifesto, 1848. Pamphlet, 23 pages, written in haste. It begins with one of the most famous sentences ever written. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. And it ends with the most quoted rallying cry in political history. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. But what did Marx actually believe? Not what was done in his name, not the Soviet Union, not Mao's China, not the gulags and the famines, and the totalitarian states that claimed his ideas as their justification. What did Marx himself actually argue? His central idea was this: In a capitalist system, the value of everything produced comes from human labor. A worker spends 8 hours a day in a factory. In those 8 hours, they produce goods worth far more than their daily wage. The difference, the surplus, is taken by the factory owner. Not because the factory owner worked for it, but because the factory owner owns the factory. Marx called this surplus value, and he argued that the entire system of capitalism was built on this extraction, on the systematic taking of value produced by workers and concentrating it in the hands of those who owned the means of production. This was not a moral argument. Marx was explicit about this. He was not saying capitalism was evil. He was saying it was a system, a specific historical system, with specific mechanisms that produced specific outcomes. And like all historical systems, before it, feudalism, slavery, mercantilism, it would eventually contradict itself, generate its own opposition, and be replaced by something new. He also gave us one of the most powerful analytical tools ever invented: historical materialism. The idea that history is not driven by great men or divine will or the march of ideas, but by material conditions. By who owns what, by how societies organize the production and distribution of the things people need to live. Every society in history, Marx argued, has been built around a fundamental conflict between those who own the means of production, the land, the factories, the tools, the capital, and those who do not. In feudal society, in ancient society, masters and slaves. In capitalist society, bourgeoisie and proletariat. History, Marx said, is the history of class struggle. And here is where it gets complicated. Because Marx was also a genuine humanist. His early writings, the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, are not the writings of a cold ideologue. They are the writings of a man who cared passionately about what industrial capitalism was doing to human beings. He wrote about alienation, the experience of the factory worker who spends 10 hours a day performing a single repetitive task, tightening the same bolt, pulling the same lever, until the work has nothing of themselves in it, until they are not a craftsman, expressing their humanity through their work, but a component of a machine, a replaceable part. Marx saw this as a profound human tragedy. Human beings are not meant to work like machines. We are creative, social, purposeful creatures. When work becomes
pure mechanical repetition
in service of someone else's profit, something essential in the human being is damaged. He called this alienated labor, and he believed it was one of the defining horrors of industrial capitalism. Now, what happened next is the most important part of this story. Marx died in 1883. He was 64 years old. He died largely unknown. His funeral was attended by 11 people. Engels delivered a eulogy that included this line: "Just as Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history." Within 30 years, revolutions claiming Marx's name were sweeping across the world. Russia, China, Cuba, Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America. And what was built in his name would have horrified him. Because the regimes that called themselves Marxist, the Soviet Union under Stalin, China under Mao,
Cambodia under Pol Pot,
were not what Marx envisioned. Marx envisioned the liberation of workers. What emerged was the most comprehensive system of worker oppression in the history of the world. State ownership replacing private ownership, but the state controlled by a tiny elite, just as brutal, just as self-serving, just as willing to exploit as any factory owner. Marx had written, "The free development of each is the condition for the free development of all." What was built in his name was the opposite, the suppression of each, the imprisonment of all. How do we understand this? Several ways. First, Marx's analysis was often brilliant, and his prescription was often dangerously vague. He described with extraordinary precision what was wrong with capitalism. He was far less precise about what should replace it. The dictatorship of the proletariat was a phrase, not a blueprint. And into that vagueness stepped men with blueprints of their own, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, who used Marx's analysis to justify their own seizure of power. Second, many of Marx's predictions did not come true. He predicted that capitalism would become increasingly brutal until workers rose up and overthrew it. What actually happened, partly in response to the threat of exactly that revolution, was that capitalist societies introduced reforms, trade unions, minimum wages, working hour limits, healthcare, social safety nets. The conditions that made Marx's analysis so urgent in 1848 were substantially improved, not by revolution, but by reform. And yet, Marx is not finished with us. His analysis of the tendency of wealth to concentrate, of the gap between those who own capital and those who do not, feels urgently relevant in an era of historic wealth inequality. His concept of alienated labor feels urgently relevant in an era of gig economies, zero-hours contracts, and the systematic erosion of worker security. His insistence that economic conditions shape consciousness, that what you own determines how you see the world, is a tool of analysis that no serious thinker has been able to discard. You do not have to be a Marxist to use Marxist analysis. You do not have to believe in the inevitability of revolution to recognize that the distribution of power in any society is always worth examining. Karl Marx spent his life in poverty, in exile, in the reading rooms of the British Museum, obsessively studying the economic structures of the world he had been born into. He wanted to understand why the world was the way it was. He wanted to change it. He changed it. Not in the way he intended, not entirely for the better, but completely. No thinker in history has had more impact on the world as it actually exists today, in its economics, its politics, its social structures, its arguments about justice and power, than Karl Marx. Not because he was right about everything, but because the questions he asked cannot be unasked. How is wealth created? Who benefits? Who pays? And is that just? Those questions are still waiting for complete answers. Subscribe to the Examined Lives. Next week, the man who built a philosophy on the shoulders of giants and then turned against every one of them. Plato, the philosopher who invented the idea of a perfect world and why it was the most dangerous idea he ever had. See you then.